From the St. Francis Yacht Club in San Francisco, this is the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon, hosted by Ron Young.
Rogue waves 100-foot tall walls of water. They appear out of nowhere in the deep ocean. And when they do, you only have seconds to respond. And they sink. They sink even the largest ships. It used to be that hundreds of large ships sank every year for unknown reasons. You see, we didn't think rogue waves were real. We thought they were once in 10,000 years events. And then in 1995, what we discovered was in an oil rig, the Dropner rig in the North Sea, an 85-foot wave slammed into it. Shortly thereafter, we discovered that 8 or 10 hours in every storm, one of these things hits. And then we discovered that they're happening everywhere in the ocean, and they're happening almost every day. One is rising up right now. Now, what causes them? When rogue waves occur, they occur because individually manageable waves, they collide and grow into something unmanageable. Now, I think we can all agree that the same thing happens in life. The same thing happens in business. Tin waves, they're colliding. And when they do, they're going to cause the next rogue wave. And there are 3 types of change, 3 undercurrents to pay attention to. There's technological change, there's economic change, and there's social change. When they collide, they're going to impact your financial assumptions, your operations. They're going to change your external environment, and they're going to impact your strategy. First, let's talk about economic trends. We're seeing the explosion of the data economy, information taking things that used to have to be physical and turning them into digital. We're seeing the explosion of labor and automation. We're seeing the rise of Asia, entire new middle classes popping up around Asia. And we're seeing an explosion of cheap money. When these things combine, they're going to change the nature of the economy profoundly. So let's look at them one by one. First, let's look at the data economy. There are 2 types of data companies, really. There are those that create value, and there are those who transfer value. And they might even have the same business plan. Let's take a look at Uber and Airbnb, for example. Uber has put more cars on the road, created more drivers, and more rides. On the flip side, Airbnb has not created value, they've transferred it. They haven't enabled the production of new low-cost housing, and they haven't offset the people who used to be in hotels. They've simply transferred value from one market to another, and they've captured it, and in many cases, taken it out of the local economies. We're seeing an explosion of labor and automation. And it's easy as an executive, as a CFO, to look at this and say, oh, great, this is great. I can make the cost of labor go away. That's one of my major expenses. There's something else you should be thinking about, which is labor availability. In most, if not all of the G20 countries, the age of the population is getting older. The availability of high-skilled labor is decreasing. When you take a look out a couple of years to 2030, the only major country that will have an excess of high-skilled labor, by which I mean people with a 4-year degree or equivalent, will be India. And they'll have enough excess labor to backfill the state of California. The rest of the world's likely going to have a problem. So you want to think about, where do you have labor availability issues, and where are you saving money? Where are you making a bet on the short-term savings, and where are you increasing your flexibility in the long term? We're seeing the rise of Asia. And it's doing 2 things. One is it's increasing consumption, which is great for the economy. If you take a look at many of the developed economies, they're primarily consumer-based. The growth is based on what people buy. The problem is that when you take someone out of rural poverty and you put them in somewhere like Texas, their resource consumption goes up about 32 times as they join that Western middle class. And that's going to cause resource constraints. No matter what happens, if you take 1 billion, 2 billion more people and you have them consuming at that level, and it's going to cause all kinds of conflict. And one of the great growth opportunities coming out of this is helping to drive that efficiency, that materials efficiency, whether it's water, whether it's land, whether it's products, whether it's energy. We're seeing the growth of cheap money, especially coming out of COVID, as governments ramp up their debt, and at the same time we see slowing structural growth. As populations get older, the reality is that they do things like buy less education, buy less houses, buy less clothes, and they tend to go out less as well to party. We're seeing an explosion of accelerating innovation. This is exciting, especially for someone like me who's been in that industry of research and development for most of his career. But the reality is that we're doing more R&D and we're doing it faster than ever before. But that's resulting in faster product cycles. The time in which you can monetize that idea, that new big idea, is shrinking. Eventually that inverts and it stops being profitable for companies to invest as much as in research and development. And we're starting to see that happen. And a lot of that effort is going to have to shift onto governments if we're going to see longer term innovations continue to happen. We're seeing an explosion of emerging technology. And this is great because it drives efficiency. Things that used to be expensive or inaccessible are suddenly inexpensive and accessible to everybody. But it also drives social change. As more things become possible, the question becomes who gets them and who doesn't. And where should we go? What should we do with them? What can't we do with them? So let's talk about some of the major emerging technologies in the information communications and technology sectors, because they'll continue to be a major driver of efficiency, whether it's artificial intelligence, whether it's the explosion of new communications networks, wireless communications networks, whether that's 5G or things like this, Starlink satellite communications. We're seeing an explosion of edge devices and Internet of Things devices, and there's a reason for this. Much of the efficiency and economic growth of the past 40 years, 50 years has been a result of something called Moore's Law, the semiconductors getting faster and cheaper on a regular basis. Well, that's going to be difficult to continue to maintain. And so we're going to see an explosion of low-cost devices on the edge as these high-cost devices and things like the Amazon cloud get more and more expensive to produce and deliver. And the networks to move between them don't move as fast as the data production of the data economy. And let's look at blockchain. It's easy to look at this as Bitcoin or some exotic cryptocurrency that drug dealers and terrorists use. But the reality is it's a database technology, and it's a database technology that makes it possible for edge and IoT devices to communicate with each other and have secure transactions even when they aren't able to communicate over wireless networks to the cloud. This is going to be increasingly important to growing that data economy, to eking out those new efficiencies that are going to do things like offset resource constraints in the future. When you take a look at these technologies, they're combining into clusters, because when you do innovation, you can't just push it into one industry or one product anymore. In many cases, it needs to drop into large economic clusters. And there are 4 major ones that are occurring simultaneously. The first is next generation manufacturing, whether it's 3D printing or robotic manufacturing on demand, or things like factory in a box technologies. These are devices that you can ship on demand to a place in Kentucky at about the time and rate of the cost of the FedEx shipment. It used to be that these things cost millions of dollars to produce. They took 9 months to a year to create. These next generation manufacturing are going to change where manufacturing happens, and they're going to change the types of devices that are produced. We're seeing an explosion of what I call beyond human technologies. These are technologies that start to sense our bodies, that start to sense what goes on inside us, that start to predict what we might want next. We're seeing an explosion of what I call frictionless business. In the first generation of the internet, and over the last 20 years, what we saw was that information communication in the world got a lot more efficient. Well, as you start to be able to track people more effectively, as you start to be able to track processes across your business, across your supply chain more effectively, it's going to be possible to actually radically increase the efficiency and decrease the friction in business. And we're seeing what I call bioconvergence, the combination of robotics, low-cost sensors and devices, AI, massive communications infrastructures, all combining at the same time to radically accelerate the rate of biotech. mRNA vaccines, COVID, all of the rapid diagnostics and the push of that through the world, that's in many ways been biotech's atom bomb moment. The next 50 years of technology development will really be in that space. How do we create better healthcare, obviously, but also how do we create more efficient materials? How do we create ways to grow food, to create proteins, to create calories that are more productive and lighter weight on the planet? We're seeing the growth of new social trends as technology and the economy change so radically. Partially due to those changing demographics we talked about throughout the last bit, we're seeing a change in digital trust. Who owns what? What should we trust? What should we not? And all of this is driving social contracts. We're seeing conflict around the world. So let's just talk about those briefly. When we talk about changing demographics, two things are really happening. One is the older generation are starting to inherit money. And that means, at least in the United States, that they're becoming wealthy when they inherit. And in many cases, those who don't are becoming proportionally poorer as their incomes drop out. Those older people, they don't generate as much consumption. And so this is going to impact growth. We're going to have to find new ways to grow our economies. We're seeing changes in digital trust. What's a public good and what's a private good? If my data, if my personal information can save 1 million lives, 1 billion lives, is it really my right to protect it? Traditionally, it would be. But I'm not so clear that that's the case anymore. We're also seeing an explosion of new social contracts and exploration around what these mean. And it's changing around the world. When you take a look at China, when you take a look at Taiwan, when you take a look at Hong Kong, you see that happening in certain ways. You take a look at what's going on in the UK and the challenges it's happening. When you take a look at what's going on in the UK and the challenges that they're having with Brexit, that's another issue. You take a look at the Capitol riots in the US in January of 2020. These questions of rights and responsibilities, of who gets what and who pays, they're going to be different. They're going to be changing. And the challenge that we all see, the challenge that we all fear, and the great hope of the future is that it keeps on coming. We keep getting disrupted. We keep having rogue waves. They keep hitting faster. They keep hitting harder. And if we plan well, if we start to be predictive about how we're going to adapt, we can create a better future for us, for our families, for our companies, and for everyone. Thank you very much.
Welcome to the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon, live from the virtual grill room of the St. Francis Yacht Club. Frequent viewers of our show know that I am addicted to racing my antique wooden racing boat Youngster in an admitted 80 races a year. I can do that by using a mobile app which distributes the crew recruiting and management to each person who wants to sail on the boat who's on an approved list. So they can open up their phone and put themselves onto a list, and voila, I benefit from a very talented crew with a diverse skill set. Our speaker today is one such person. It's been fun racing with him on Youngster, and today he's back on what you'll see is a very exciting subject. He was born in Boston, remembers his first nautical memory of being a 2-year-old on the steamboat Delta Queen in the Mississippi. He was raised in rural fishing villages in Maine and would become a young star at Pratt, where he got a degree in industrial design. Thereafter, he spent several years collaborating with the celebrated MIT Media Lab and then consulting to the most prestigious names in the Fortune 50 on product innovation, including Microsoft, Sony, and Verizon. And in 2016, Hewlett-Packard brought him on board as their global futurist. In that role, he managed a $15 million research project on major trends in the future and how to leverage them. In that context, he ultimately wrote a book, which he's introducing today, Rogue Waves, How to Future-Proof Your Business. So Jonathan Brill, it's fun to see you in the business context where instead of writing waves on Youngster, we can write business waves with your really exciting book. Welcome to the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon.
Thank you so much, Ron, and it's wonderful to be with entrepreneurs like yourself.
Talk to us a little bit. Your basic premise is that rogue waves are not only in the yachting world and in the ocean, but they transform businesses and enterprises and economies. And so give me some examples of, several rogue waves in the history of business.
Sure. So what I think we fail to recognize is that we design our businesses based on the concept of compound growth, that things will do 6% better next year and 6% better the year after that. The reality is that doesn't really work, and there's a reason why. And it's that we fail to recognize compound volatility, that the baseline can change radically in a moment, like it did in the face of COVID, the 2008 financial crisis. Over the 20th century, we faced about 400 business shocks in the United States. That's about one a quarter. And when they overlapped, they created massive disruption, and they created opportunities for new winners and also old losers. The question when we think about strategy today, if you believe that the world's getting more volatile and all of the indicators that we've identified suggest that it is, the real strategy is to look at resilience, right? How do you respond? How do you change when these things happen more quickly than your competitors? And how do you use that as blue ocean? How do you use that as the opportunity to take advantage and to take market share? When you look at companies that have resilient growth strategies, like I'm suggesting, they tend to do about twice as well in the downturn, and they tend to maintain that growth in the upturn, right? Once the stability happens again, because they've in many ways designed the rules of the new competitive environment.
So describe three, let's say, top rogue waves in the past.
Sure. COVID, obviously, 2008, obviously, in our careers. But there was a day in 1927 when the Mississippi River was 80 miles wide. Imagine that. It displaced 600,000 people in 1927. What would happen today if that occurred, right? What would happen if that overlapped with COVID, right? What would happen if it overlapped with a geopolitical issue? Right? What would happen if it overlapped with labor disputes? These things, the issue isn't any one specific business shock. It's what happens when they overlap, when that volatility compounds to become unmanageable.
Talk about how companies become rapidly adaptive. How are companies and their management teams adaptive to these unforeseen changes?
I get to talk about Amazon because it's fun to talk about Amazon, but the same things apply if you're my friend's small family farm in Ohio. The first thing to do is to focus on awareness, right? What are the range of possible things that could impact you? And what would happen if maybe these individually manageable disruptions, waves of change, overlapped in a specific place and time that you weren't expecting? Would your finances be resilient? Would your operations be resilient? How would it change your external environment, and how would it change your strategy, your demand forecasts? And the way you want to really think about resilience is not how do I protect myself from a meteor falling from the skies, or how do I protect myself from a hurricane, or how do I protect myself from a war or a riot or anything. It's what impacts would different combinations of these things have on my business. But I think more importantly, because I'm a professional futurist at this point, and I get to deal with Hollywood on things like coming up with ideas for new disaster movies. I think it's fun to talk about the downsides of these things, but it turns out that entrepreneurs really want to talk about the upsides. When you start thinking about radical changes and how they'll impact businesses. You can look at how you do process innovation in your organization, how you become more effective, but you can also think about precisely where can you create value for your customers, right? If my customer had a financial issue, had an asset loss, how could I help them be more resilient? If my customer had unreliable demand forecasts, how could I help them make sure that they're hitting their revenue targets? And so these things are interrelated, right? Risk is a two-sided coin. It's about threats and it's about opportunity. It's a measure of volatility. And that, at the end of the day, is the measurement of change over time. If you take a look at the last 30 years or so, what you realize is that more billionaires are minted in downturns than in upturns. Maybe not in Silicon Valley, but around the world.
I get that your premise applies to all kinds of organizations.
Hmm.
I get that the America's Cup was disrupted when Kiwis started pedaling with their legs and leaving their arms free to control the flight of an America's Cup boat. I get that, commodores at yacht clubs have to quickly adapt to the fact that they can no longer serve cocktails at the bar, and that skippers of organizations, CEOs, have to quickly adapt as the conditions around them change rapidly. But how can organizations of all sorts do an audit on the ability of their own organization to adapt to rapid change?
So I think that type of pressure testing is unbelievably important. So we talked a little bit about, you'd asked, how do you become resilient? So we talk in the book about what I call the ABCs of resilient growth. So how do you increase awareness? How do you create the behaviors? How do you create awareness of potential changes? What's going on outside? How do you create the behaviors? How do you create the skills within your organization to understand those changes, to be resilient to them, and then to exploit them? If you don't have those skill sets in your organization, it doesn't really matter that they understand that there's a tsunami coming. They're still just standing on the beach. The third thing, the C and the ABCs of resilient growth, is really about culture change, right? How do you create the processes and the incentives that encourage looking outside your organization and saying, hey, there's an iceberg out there. I don't quite know what it is. I can kind of see its outlines. Those are, especially in mature organizations, often very scary conversations to have for especially a junior employee. And so how do you create those processes and those incentives that make it possible? And it turns out that, these aren't like $1 million bonus problems. Often it's just kind of how do you ask questions and how do you manage meetings so that you get the most out of your people, and you encourage them to think about the bigger picture while managing the details.
In the 2021 America's Cup, just held in Auckland, New Zealand, a real rogue wave happened when the wind died so much that the boats actually fell off their foils and were now sailing around at, 1/10 the speed. And the Kiwis had apparently figured out how they could get their boat up in lighter breeze and figured out what angle of sail and what sail control and lift control they needed to do that. And in reality, the Italian boat lost the race they were leading by a whole leg because they were not prepared for such a wildly disruptive, unexpected occurrence. These boats are going 50 knots and all of a sudden they're going 6. They were completely transformed into these slower beasts. So how can you look around your own team of whatever form and keep trying to future-proof their own skill set?
So I think there's sort of two answers to that question. In terms of looking at the types of skills we need as leaders and the types of skills we need as decision makers, often, senior executives like you or I, we've developed high-level executive judgment, but we need to be pushing that down into the organization. And I think there are 5 really basic skills that we need. One is reality testing. How do you know that what was true yesterday is still true today? How do you know that your assumptions hold? The second is the ability to observe systems, right? We often teach people to work in this linear way. You do this, you do this, you do this, you do this, you follow the Gantt chart. Well, that doesn't really work in complex systems anymore. It doesn't work in software-oriented businesses anymore. Things are too agile. There's too much change. The third is the ability to look at the range of possible futures, to generate not just like, what if we do 6% better or worse this year, but what if we have an AMC year where we thought we had a good strategy going into 2020, but we go bankrupt? or we nearly go bankrupt and we have to take on $1 billion? Or what if we have a year like Amazon where, we had 26 times growth in 2020? Like, neither organization was ready for those situations. What's impressive to me about a company like Zoom is that they were ready to absorb the opportunity. Right? That's a special thing. You would think going into this, Microsoft had all the contracts in place. They had the technology in place. They even had, Teams and Skype, on people's machines. It's really easy to look at this and say, oh, it's about the money, or no, it's about the board, the investor thesis. No, it's not. It's absolutely not. It's about a mindset. So we talked about generating that range of futures. The fourth piece is about uncoupling threats from opportunities, right? Understanding how maybe by changing the timing, the sequencing, how you hedge bets, you can make bigger ones while offloading risks. So you take a look at a company like Toyota, who in 2012, the Fukushima nuclear disaster, their supply chains were radically disrupted. These are the guys who invented lean manufacturing. I mean, these guys are the leanest, greenest, roughest, toughest manufacturer out there. And they got disrupted because local production in Japan wasn't able to hold, right? They weren't able to continue because of the disaster. So they rethought what they were doing, and they figured, okay, there are these little buffers we need around our supply chain so that we can respond to these changes in our environment. And so in 2016, when there was a natural disaster in Taiwan that upended the semiconductor market, everyone else had trouble. All of the other car manufacturers had trouble. Toyota didn't. They just went right through it. What happened in the middle of COVID? The same thing, right? The manufacturers who didn't have that rogue wave mindset, failed to be resilient to the opportunity. And while every car manufacturer had a bad year last year, aside from maybe Tesla, Toyota actually reseated its spot as the number one automobile manufacturer in the world.
So you made a really great metaphor in your presentation. I got a new appreciation of octopuses with their 8 legs. And you talked about the fact that they actually do have 8 brains. And it was beautiful to look at what really does look like a kind of a ballet, as the 8 different legs are all reaching for different opportunities. And while the central brain seems to synthesize those opportunities, how does somebody get 8 brains to develop inside the company or inside the organization, whether it's a yacht club, whether it's a maxi boat, whether it's a company?
There are 3 things, right? The question is, how do you devolve power and authority in an organization while making sure that everybody's coordinated? And I think there are a couple of things, right? One is the processes and incentives, right? Do your processes encourage people to innovate autonomously and to coordinate around those autonomous innovations? The second is really about how we operate as leaders and how we train our people. At the end of the day, a lot of when you hear these stories of, well, someone down in the boiler room knew that there was a problem, but it didn't get to the captain and the ship sank. Like, we've all heard this story. We've all probably experienced this story. We've all probably been the captain. The reality is we didn't teach our people how to communicate, that they saw a wave on the horizon, that they saw that iceberg. And we didn't take the time to listen and hear. And so one of the things I suggest is what I call lead messaging, right? You teach people to say, here's the logic behind what I think is happening. I'm not sure about it yet, but I think there's something there. The second is empathy, right? How do I, as a junior person, understand your problem as a leader? I think I'm seeing what your priorities are here and here and here. I see this other thing that might not necessarily align with it, but I'd like to better understand. So you're building empathy as a junior person so that the leader can both teach and absorb that, because it's not you telling them what to do. It's you as a junior person listening to what to do. The third is authority, right? I might not be an expert on this. I'm certainly not the CEO, but when I was, you talked about my being on the Delta Queen. When I was 2 years old on the Delta Queen, I experienced this thing, and this feels maybe like something very similar at a much bigger scale. And then the last thing is the D, right? And lead, which is the deadline, right? Lots of time to think about this, but if in the next 4 days we don't respond to this, here are the consequences. And so this is basic executive communications probably for you or for I, but most people below the top levels of an organization don't know how to do this. And if you just simply teach people how to build these skills, how to build these communications, the likelihood of them being able to move ideas up to you expands tremendously, and your ability to hear them, also the efficiency of that whole process. The second thing that I think is really important is getting better at giving directions. So I'm still a mediocre personnel manager, but I used to be terrible. And there was a moment in my career when I had this former special forces officer who was my head of strategy. And this guy, man, he was he was smart, and he got pissed off as only a former special forces officer can, and said, listen, here's if I'm going to continue to work for you, here's how you're going to give orders. Here's how we gave them in the military, right? And he said, first thing, what's the context? Right? What do we know about the situation? What do we not know about the situation? What do we think is likely to change? The second is what's the objective? Where are you going? What are you trying to do? The third is what are the criteria for success? How do we know we'll be successful? How do we know we'll not? How do we know that the goals have changed? The third is risk bands. And I think this is really important as a leader. It's very easy to say, this is the most risk I want you to take. Don't go above this. If you're in finance, this right level or whatever. But the second thing that's really important is what's the least amount of risk you want them to take, right? Like so you want to incentivize them in bands. And the last piece is who's in charge while I'm gone, right? As a leader, we all know this. We give directions, we give half thought out directions, and then we disappear for 3 weeks and we get shocked when something crazy happened or nothing happened. And the last piece is, what do you do if everything goes haywire? How do you make sure that there's the foghorn, the foghorn in the storm, the lighthouse in the storm? And if you just do those things, if you add those 6 criteria to how you give directions, it turns out that people can act autonomously in a really coordinated way without you having to be there in the middle pulling all the levers all the time. And that's how you get the scale, those 2 things, giving people the skills to communicate up, and then giving that direction so that the organization can operate autonomously without you. That's how you become an octopus.
It seems to me that as the rate of communication increases, the rate of change accelerates. And as that happens, the need for innovation increases. I keep thinking to myself, controlled economies slow the rate of innovation. And yet we see all this hand-wringing about China growing. So what is China doing right? And what are we not doing right? Or what are we doing wrong?
So I think there's a very open question underneath that, which is that true that control economies slow the rate of innovation? We have this Soviet era vision of its communism versus democracy. And I think the question is it communism versus capitalism? Right? Is that really the argument? Because what you see is a highly capitalist society in China.
Right.
It's getting this growth. I look at it. I'm constantly impressed whenever I spend time in southern China, in Beijing. Both the quality of governance, and that's a lot of people feel differently, but I think the quality of governance is relatively high for the breadth of population. Right? If you take a look at any other billion-person population, right? Do you see better governance over the entire billion-person population? I think they're doing a really good job, and they're having some growth problems right now, but they're certainly still beating the pants off of us. When you take a look at the level of innovation in China. One thing I think about a lot is triadic patents. So these are high quality patents that could be filed anywhere in the world. When you take a look back to 2000, China basically produced none. You go to today, they're producing more than Germany. And this has been a straight line. And this isn't like crappy like patents on different colored toilet paper. These are real patents. If you go out to 2027, 2030, China will be producing more high quality patents than the United States. They're also a major producer of new PhDs. Now, these PhDs aren't all created equal, but then again, PhDs from Indiana State and PhDs from MIT aren't created equal either. So, I'd kind of look at that and say, within this volume, There's a core of quality. When you take a look at those PhDs, 5 years ago, they were still filling the academic ranks. If you take a look out today, 5 years from now, there's a problem, which is that they don't have academic positions for those PhDs. They have to move into industry, which means, when you take a look at these two things, China's moving from being an innovation importer to, with its patents, being an innovation exporter, to China's moving from training innovators to actually commercializing innovation. Right, this is going to be a rogue wave on a massive scale. So when you take a look at this move from innovation import to innovation export, I think we're in for a big surprise in the United States in terms of what our role is in the world. When you take a look at the number of countries that trade more with China, with the U.S., it's all but a few already trade more with China than with the U.S. Germany does. The U.K. With the U.S. it's France, I think the U.K. and Italy, and obviously Canada and Mexico are our major trade partners. This is going to be a major shift, a tectonic shift. It's going to be a rogue wave, and I don't think we're ready for it. When you take a look at the way we've been doing R&D spending in this country, what you see is over the last since the early 1980s, federal R&D spend has been flat or below GDP growth. And when you take a look at private R&D spend, it's exploded. But how much of that is really R and how much of that is D? Right? And a lot of it's development, and it's a tax scheme. And so what I think we need to do is get really serious about, we're looking at radically increasing our federal R&D budget in this country, but we need to get really serious about, are we filling a backlog, or are we just trying to get back to even? Because when you take a look at the level of spend right now, it's about trying to get back to even and competing on feature parity with China. We're going to be, number one or number two in quantum materials, or we're going to be number one or number two in such and such, as opposed to we're going to be number one in a thing that no one else can compete in. So we really need to rethink our national industrial strategy and our innovation strategy.
So I'd like to review rogue waves in public and economic policy now. Many of us remember Milton Friedman in the Reagan era 80s when we started talking about trickle-down economics. What's the shift if we go to bubble-up economics? And how does that change, and how productive is it if, in fact, you have a broad middle class who has more and more spending power, and the money comes from that consumer-driven spend versus an elite who's got enough money to buy their 5th boat or their 10th boat? Talk a little bit about that rogue wave in change of economic and public policy.
There are a couple of bigger points there. The first is when you look at Friedman's core argument, his core argument was that the government doesn't have enough granular real-time data to manage the economy. Do you believe that was certainly true in 1967, right, when he started writing about a lot of this stuff? Sure. Is it really true in 2027? I don't think so. I think we need to question the core thesis, right? It was definitely true, and the deregulation we did in the 1970s was definitely important to growth. But today, is that the best way forward? I'm not arguing for or against. I'm saying that we need to rethink this underlying situation. The second difference between the late 1960s, early 1970s, and today is that we are a radically overproductive economy. Right? The reason that globalization has happened is because we have too much productivity. We're trying, on the planet, we're trying to figure out where to stick it. How many boats do you have? How many pairs of shoes do you have? Historically, you look back at that, and doesn't that seem a little insane? And so we have a different kind of problem. We look at money as a store of value, right? And we think of it as somehow still tied to the gold standard or something, but it's not. It's not an absolute anymore. It's a variable. And that's why we've been able to print so much money over the last, year and a half, is that we're shifting certainly who owns that proportion of the total wealth, but we aren't actually taking gold out of people's pockets to do it. And so it's a different kind of world we live in. And I think that we can do a lot more what you called bubble up than we've been doing. When you take a look at Keynes, who was kind of got bastardized in the United States, his underlying hypothesis was that you can drive inflation as long as you drive the incomes of the bottom quartile of the population, to sustain that inflation, because it's just a ratio. It's not based on an absolute dollar value. It's in the kind of world we live in now. It's just a ratio. The strategic question to be asking, and this may be getting a step too geeky. Certainly, feel free to stop me. Is you can do this in the U.S. You can do it in the U.K. You might be able to do what's called modern monetary theory in the EU. You can probably do it in China, because we're large enough and we do enough internal trade that we can kind of play that game. But my question is, for all of the other countries, what's the impact of the dollar suddenly being worth half as much, or suddenly being worth twice as much because of a monetary policy game, right? That can decimate a country like Cambodia, which has been a real growth miracle for the last number of years. But effectively, they trade on the dollar. And, if they need to take on debt, are we really, is the U.S. really going to take on that debt in Cambodian real? No, we're going to take it in on the dollar. So those shifts in valuation can decimate the global economy. And so we need to think about, this larger balance, right? What's good for us today? What's good for the world? How do we maintain peace? How do we maintain a stable growth curve for the world? Because at the end of the day, if we're overproductive as an economy, if we don't build our trade partners, we have a foundational problem.
So China keeps pretty close control on public discourse. And we're seeing the big protests in Hong Kong right now over the inability of the people in Hong Kong to write what they want in their own newspapers, etc. Doesn't controlling public discourse decrease the rate of new ideas and innovation that float around between people?
That's a great question. I think we need to put a little more subtlety on what China really puts the kibosh on, because we do it here. And this is, I'm going to say something a little incendiary. The Chinese government, the CCP, has a problem with questioning the legitimacy of the government. If you go into the Capitol building and you say this is not a legitimate government, while we're trying to figure out how to put a new person in office, it turns out we don't like that either. So these are scales, right? These are scales of response. But when you take a look at the people who have been arrested from the Capitol riots, the majority of the charges are nonviolent charges. Think about that. Mm-hmm. Majority of the charges are nonviolent charges. I'm not saying that I support the Capitol rioters. I think those people are nuts. But what I'm saying is that there's more of an analog here than we might choose to believe.
So how do leaders empower the transformation process? Or first, let's say transformation officer. There are some of those in companies these days.
So first of all, you have to empower them. and when people come to you, and they will, and it'll be backhanded, and they come to you and say that guy. Yeah, you have to say, yeah, I hired that guy specifically so that you would say that. Like you got to back him, even if you don't believe in him. And
you're proving it's working. You're proving it's working.
You just proved the point. The second is you've got to be really clear as a leader. We were talking earlier about risk bands, right? How much change do you want? I came in and I helped a mom and pop innovation consultancy double their sales in about 6 months. And he said, now we've got to put all these processes in place to, so we can be a grown-up firm, because they can do it again in about another 6 months. And it turned out they didn't want that, right? They didn't want to have the change. They kind of like being in a positive financial space, but they didn't like the cost of doing it. So you got to be really clear as a leader about what your pain tolerance is. How long you're willing to accept it, and how long you're willing for things to take. My experience on corporate change, and this might be different than the literature, but my experience is, we always try and kind of pull the Band-Aid off as slow as possible. I have never once seen that work. And so, if you're going to be a leader, you need to really think about that, right? Like, what do you want from this person, and how much are you willing to protect? How long are you willing to protect them? And just have clarity about that, because, this person, they're not going to have any trust among your employees, and they're not going to trust you if you are not 100% follow through on that, and the change won't happen. what we see is most of the time is very rare for transformations to actually work. But that's the first step. The second is, there's a whole bunch of stuff we talk about in the book about how do you create those organs of change within the organization, and we talk about kind of the 4-step process for doing that.
So let's talk about rogue waves in governance. It seems to me that a foundational problem in representative government these days is gerrymandering. 100 and even 20 years ago, gerrymandering consisted of very few small, knowledgeable folks sitting down together and carving up the electorate to keep themselves reinforced and reelected. But the data-driven collection of psychographic and demographic information, which now allows for computer-driven gerrymandering, basically takes away representative government to such an extent that we're seeing the ability for people in power to stay in power for longer than their representation would otherwise keep them in power. They'd be voted out, where we now see 37% of the electorate can control 51% of the votes. How do we basically apply this premise of rogue waves and a need to revise past patterns and performance and practices within governance?
That's a powerful question. Within that, I think there's a second issue, which is that our Constitution was literally set up to cause this problem. What we're seeing is that works. The question is whether that's what we want. At the end of the day, you need to have that protection of the minority. And I think the question is, potentially, how do we do that better? Whatever's happening right now certainly isn't working. When I was in Chile in 2019, I sat down with the leaders of the major government offices and elected officials, and many of the large companies that are family companies, representatives from those organizations. And I sat down and I said, hey, you have some foundational problems in your economy in terms of how you're educating people, the capital that's available for investment in entrepreneurial firms for those people who have just gotten out of bachelor's and master's degrees. They have the ability to organize. They have the skills to organize, and yet you're not giving them the opportunity to turn that into opportunity. You're trying to turn them into people who work for you. Eventually, that's going to be a problem, that you're trying to sustain an elite. About 14 days later, there were riots across the country. They've had to rewrite the Constitution. And about 6 months after that, they came to me and they said, okay, well, what do we do about this? And my answer to them is there are a lot of things we can do about this, but the real question is, why did you try and take up big wave surfing after the rogue wave hit? Right? Like, this is a practice. How do we respond how do we become resilient to these changes? And the reason I bring up Chile is not to toot my own horn. It's that the income disparity in the Bay Area is at the same level as it was in Chile the day before those riots. We're going to see more domestic tension because of income disparity in the United States. And what we saw with the Capitol riots, what we saw with Black Lives Matter, that's the beginning of a decade-long trend.
As a young fellow in the 50s, I watched Eisenhower's high tax rate and large infrastructure spending policies create swimming pools and parks, recreation centers, and schools all across America. The interstate highway system became an economic growth engine that the middle class benefited from. And the 2 chickens in every pot and 2 cars in every garage became an aspirational model that people around the world saw and wanted to be like America. And it seems to me that the essence of leadership is that people want to be like you, want to do what you do. Mm-hmm. And it seems to some of us that rather than spending money trying to control other governments, economies, and nations, it would be most productive from a defense posture to make America that beacon on the hill that everybody wants to imitate again, which will also increase the value of, our brand America and the products we export. It seems to me that there's some economic benefit of us creating such a model. Mm-hmm. Is there any evidence that that might be correct?
You're asking the big questions today. So I would say 2 things. What you're talking about in the 1950s was a result of a couple of things. One is every other major country had chosen to bomb their economies to death, and by the way, decided to pay us for the opportunity to do that. So there was a really unique time in history there. The second thing that was happening was that we had a population boom. And so in a consumption-driven economy, right, something close to 70%, I think, of the U.S. economy is consumer-driven, right?
Yes.
That boom of young people, right? That's huge. Like they want to buy Levi's, they want to buy educations, they want to buy first houses, they want to buy used boats, they want to buy cars, right? And so the that opportunity was a result of that situation. We now have a really broken immigration policy in this country. And if we don't get that figured out, we have a serious problem because we're moving toward a population inversion in this country today, right? So what happens to our tax base? What happens to social services spending? What happens to all of these things that you're saying America make America great if we don't resolve this central issue? So I think about that. The third piece you were talking about is US China competition effectively, right? Like how do we split up the world, or do we split up the world? The US has benefited since World War II from its strategic position as kind of a defender of the free world, or what we call the free world, free world plus state sponsored despots. That was really important when the growth was in a physical economy. I think in the Bay Area, we underestimate how important that just the atoms of the world are, right? Because that's not what we trade in here. But that's going to continue to be really important. If you take a look over the next 15 years or so, we'll see something like 1 billion people entering the US level middle class, the San Francisco level middle class. So this isn't like the World Bank version where it's $3 or $10 a day. This is like, people earning, the local equivalent of 35,000 US dollars a year. If you take that out to 2040 or 2050 and you think it's 2 billion, over the billion and a half today, right? That gets to be 3.5 billion people. But the reason I bring that up is that if you take a person out of rural poverty and you put them into San Francisco, their resource consumption goes up 32 times. Where do those resources come from? So part of our defense posture moving forward will be making sure that there's enough resources available for us and for our strategic partners. Now, who pays for that security? Who pays for that stability? That's an open question, but I think that's going to be really important. Second thing to be thinking about is our defense posture on cyber. So in the world of nuclear arms, in the world of fighting for mountains and valleys, right? We could use strategic deterrence, right? We're going to have, you buy a nuclear bomb, we're going to buy 10. I'm not sure that kind of deterrence really works in the world of pure competition for cyber, right? For two reasons. One is the escalation is so fast. And the second is that the culpability for a lot of these things is hard to point to. So, would you want to claim something as a casus belli for something that, say, North Korea didn't actually do? That it was some kid in his garage? Like that seems like a pretty dangerous path to go down. I'm going to go a little conspiracy theory here, but for as an example, say China actually did accidentally let out COVID from their virology lab. I don't personally think that's the likely thing that happened, but say they did. Would we really want to know? Because if they accidentally killed 1 million Americans, that would be a cause for war. And they would go back and they would say, okay, well, we had this 100 years, what they call the 100 years of humiliation, where the US and other countries were basically extracting the piggy bank of the country. And they'd say, we're not going to go back to that. We're not going to pay you for this thing. And then you end up in a conflict that you can't get out of. And so my point with a lot of the cyber stuff is it ends up in that space where you might or might not want to actually know what's going on. And if you do, it accelerates. My point is, I don't know how deterrence works, and I don't know how defense spending works in that world.
So let's discuss economic deterrence versus military deterrence.
Mm-hmm.
It seems more and more likely that if you want to stop Russia from doing whatever they're doing in cyber war, economically depriving the elite in Russia from certain goodies and benefits they get from being rich might be more effective than threatening to blow parts of Russia up. We're not really likely to do that. We're not likely to blow up St. Petersburg. But if we keep them from buying Mercedes and we basically restrict them economically, maybe that's a more effective modern tool that we didn't have 100 years ago.
But we can keep them from buying Jeeps. I don't know if we can keep them from buying Lamborghinis, right? Like these are not situations we have control over. Well, Lamborghinis we probably can because Italy's still a larger trade partner with us than China. But I don't know that we can keep them from buying Mercedes, right? If you really see the block that seems to be forming between Russia and China, I question whether that in Eastern Europe, I question whether that's possible.
So we might have passed the moment when we could use economic deterrence.
We're using a lot of economic deterrence with Russia right now, and plenty of people are still eating caviar. So yeah, so I think it's a question of, you know, how hard can you push? Is it worth it? So when we talk about these conflicts and military tension, Russia's making a lot of noise because Russia is a lesser power, right? The real game over the next couple of decades will be between India, between China, and the United States, to some extent the EU, and to some extent Japan, right? But that's the game. The rest of this is an attempt to sustain, maintain a position or put a wedge in the situation. And so when you take a look at Russia, the question is really how much to respond to the tensions. And I think the better question is, where can we find common ground, right? Where can we find ways to be of use to each other?
Within the next decade, India is going to be bigger than China. It will surpass China as the largest nation on earth. What is India doing wrong?
Largest nation by population?
Yeah, by population.
Yeah. Both India and China have a foundational problem, which is they are not historically one nation. They're not historically one people. Over the last 100 years, China has really focused on building a Han culture, the Han people, their culture across China, for better or worse. That's a lot of what's happening with the Uyghur population right now in Western China, is an attempt to convince that population that they're Chinese and have the same values as the Han culture. We'll see if that works or not. I think it's a pretty intense situation. When you take a look at India, right? India was many different countries that were conquered by the British, and the British pretty much, you know, after World War II, pulled the ejector cord, right? And in this country where, you know, you can go from one town to the next, and they speak different languages, and they have different gods, right? Like, it's a fascinating place. There are 32 distinct cuisines in India, just to give you a sense. And so the what are they doing wrong? Well, if you believe that democracy works, right, and the equal say works, they're doing everything right? They're growing slowly. They're working through these conversations. My foundational concern is that the Hindu majority is really undercutting the Muslim minority. Now, in terms of practicing Muslims, not ethnic Muslims, practicing Muslims, most people don't know this, but India has the largest practicing Muslim population in the world, larger than it, more ethnic Muslims in Indonesia, but more practicing in India. If you take that group and you try to turn them into an underclass, this is a strategic problem, right? China's going to likely use that minority and to try and be disruptive within India. Pakistan certainly will, as Pakistan certainly is. And it's going to be really difficult to grow the economy with strong governance until you deal with this problem. I don't know how they get out of it.
Lastly, the book. How long did it take you to write it? What was your process, and how will you measure its success?
These are all great questions.
How long did it take to write it?
So it took about 3 years of research and about 9 months to write. And I had just an incredible team. If you take a look at the acknowledgments, it was just amazing to have the resources of HP and the resources I've had through my career and within the federal government to support a lot of this work, as well as Oxford Economics, which provide a lot of data for us.
So what was your process? Did you get up in the morning? What were your hours like? How did you do it? When were you in meetings on the subject with collaborators?
I had a chance to take a year off, read something like 100 books, and they weren't Stephen King. They weren't a geeky thing. It was a 12, 16 hour a day, just kind of obsessive year. And we got to research everything from the anatomy of an octopus to how Vespucci moved, how we managed the supply lines to move through South America, and how that was different than the way that Columbus did. I got to read the SEC filings of all of the Fortune 50 companies and do a study of how they were different. We did an index of major business shocks of the 20th century in the United States. So it was just a blast to work through the whole thing.
That's a great reference. Speaking of disruptive moments, Amerigo Vespucci gave us our name. America comes from Amerigo Vespucci.
Yeah,
exactly
it
right.
does. Yeah.
So how would you measure the success of the book if you look back 3 years from now?
For me, it's about two things. One is driving interesting conversations, right? Just, you never know where you put these things out in the world, you give them to 50,000 people, and inevitably something you didn't expect happens. That's the first and most exciting thing. The second is really helping organizations navigate this increasingly volatile world where we've designed our companies assuming that tomorrow will look like today and that we can drive efficiency on that assumption. I think what we've really learned from COVID and from 2008 is that's not true, and it's going to be far less true moving forward.
So, Jonathan, so much fun to see you complete this great project. You became practically a hermit from the social world in sailing while you worked on the book, and it's wonderful. Your presentation is very thought-provoking. I'm very happy to bring you onto the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon. It'd be fun to go sailing again as soon as you're out of the cocoon and the media bubble of the launch of the book. Congratulations on a great piece of work. Thanks so much for being our guest on the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon.
Thanks so much. I can't wait to get my sea legs back on.
Good on you, mate. And with that, we adjourn this issue of the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon.
This has been a presentation of the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon.